Curt Collier, has been the interim leader since February. He has served 3 ethical societies, St. Louis, Riverdale Yonkers, and the New York Society for over 20 years. He is also former instructor at the Humanist Institute and is a frequent guest speaker on ethical biocentrism. When not at the Society, Curt is the National Youth Programs Director for Groundwork USA, an environmental organization created by the National Park Service and the EPA. He oversees programs for up to 250 youth each year in 9 national parks and works to provide additional youth programming to 20 cities. He is also a frequent guest speaker for the National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on ways to engage diverse audiences within our national parks. Curt is a single father and lives with his son Andy in Norfolk, Virginia, when not in New Jersey. And here's Curt.
Thank you very much. We still stumble sometimes over this technology and moving back and forth, and our apologies. There we go. But we're trying to do the best we can, and we appreciate all the work. And what you don't see behind the scenes are all the people who are also making this work. There's David and Susan are sitting over there running back and forth and moving microphones, and all this stuff happens. We have several people, Arians here, who help us run all these things, and people online who help with Zoom. It's a big production, and we want to make sure we're thanking them as well. And for people to understand, this takes a lot of effort to do it this way. It seems so unnatural to us to a certain extent. We're all trying to do the best we can to make this work, and unfortunately, this may be the new normal for a little bit more longer, but we'll do what we can, okay? So thank you all for that. You know, it just kind of points out the fact that how tough life is, and life is tough for a lot of different reasons. It's got a lot of great things too, but it's tough. You know, the poet Wisława Szymborska said, "The sorry fact is that we arrive here improvised and leave without the chance to practice. Even if there is no one dumber, even if you're the planet's biggest dunce, you can't repeat this class in summer. This course is only offered once." It's a lovely piece of poetry. People always wonder why I quote so much poetry, and I think sometimes what poets can do is capture things in a few words that would probably take me 4 pages to say. But it's also, she points out in that poetry, that was actually the beginning of a poem that she has called Nothing Twice, in which she also talks about the challenges of relationships. I want to kind of paint a little picture why relationships matter so much to us, and maybe not so much with other different groups, and not to set them up as straw mans and saying that, you know, their beliefs are superficial, but for us, the idea is relationships are primary, and that's not necessarily the way in which most Americans kind of go about their everyday, at least not in their ideologies or their religions. You know, the philosopher Nietzsche, who was quite misunderstood, wrote a book called The Genealogy of Morals, in which he basically said that where your ethics come from depends on the context in which they were developed. Right? That makes sense, depending on the social, the political, the power struggles, all those things. And from that, most of us draw our ethics. He said that the primary ethics that he was responding to was his belief in what Christianity ethics was all about. And he used that as an example in his book, Genealogy of Morals. He said that when Christianity got its start, it was actually amongst the people who had been enslaved by the Romans, or the people who were not in power. And therefore, the ethics that that group chose was the opposite of the Romans. Rather than believing in strength and will, they would emphasize being gentle as lambs in spirit, and the meek shall inherit the earth, right? And rather than talk about all these other ways that we should be creative and dominant and push our values out there and kind of understand ourselves, that the Christians would reflect timidity and pulling back and things like that. And he says it's really because of the way that they found themselves influenced that that's what the morality was. The rabbis actually tell a kind of a similar tale. that actually when the Jewish people left Egypt, they had to spend 40 years in the desert, according to the Midrash. And the reason being is that they had a morality of enslaved people as well. And it would take them 40 years of being in the desert for a new generation to arise who would think differently about how we should be in the world. So this idea that somehow our context influences our ways that we believe about ethics and what we emphasize can be seen in lots of traditions. So the question I always ask is there an American context from which we develop our own ethics? Is our ethics really the one that we most believe in and the one that seems the one that serves our best, or is it merely a reflection of the values that come out of our society? So what shaped our society and what makes it look the way it does? One thing it's important to remember is, and I've said this many times, is how important it is to think of American society as being shaped by the Calvinist ideas of the early founders. There were many people living in North America, of course, before the Pilgrims arrived. But the story we tell, just as we did in Thanksgiving, is their story. This one group of religious radicals arriving on the shores of Massachusetts in 1620, despite the fact that there were already communities here 100 years earlier than that with different sets of values. We tell their story. Those are the values that we really kind of uphold to. And the question is how did that happen? How did that values become so important to us? And part of that, of course, is while the religious wars raged in Europe between Catholics and Protestants, many of the people who were caught in the middle of that struggle are also the ones that fled here. This was not a good place to go. They weren't heading towards paradise. They knew it would be a struggle. There would be starvation, there'd be hard winters, they were leaving everything they knew behind. They were going to what they thought may be a Zion, but could also be a really, really bad place, because that's the stories that were coming back, right, of how difficult it was to live into this new place. But any place was better there than where they were coming from. And so they left. The Calvinists, the Huguenots, the Calvinists of several different stripes came here. And their story, the reason, the things that they held to and their values, of course, shaped their identity. And according to their religious belief, where the Catholics and the Protestants, basically the Lutherans and the Episcopalians, argued over who should be in charge, right? Rather than one papa, the Pope as it was called, there would be several bishops in charge. It was about polity. It was also about how we view the Eucharist and those things. But the Calvinists had a completely different view of the religion. They were not Catholics, they were not Protestants, we call that the Reformation. They had a very different way of looking at the world. And their way of looking at the world was one in which I have my own personal relationship with my divine being, right? And that's the only thing that mattered. Salvation could not be found in a church. That's one of the things John Calvin emphasized. In fact, each of us must work out our own religious destiny. That was one of his main influences. The reason being is that some of you are born to go to heaven regardless of whatever you do, predestination, and some of you, no matter what you do, are going to go to hell. That's just the way it is. So then why would these people trust you? And because nobody knew exactly who was going into heaven and who was going to hell, therefore we would just put our faith in God, right, for our own salvation and work out our own salvation. Now, this was very different from what the Catholics and the Lutherans and other people were saying, that there was no salvation outside of the church, outside of the community. But that was not true what was going on here. And this had a big influence on American thinking. This whole idea that we should work out our own destiny. I told you the story of Anne Hutchinson, the parkway that's named over her just across the river here. She had this whole belief called antinomianism, that, listen, since I don't know if who is saved and who is damned, why do we even listen to the rules of community? Because maybe those rules are nothing more than the devil talking in a way. Because Satan can work through community, but I have my own relationship. And I don't need you, I don't need community, I don't need anything but my personal relationship. So you see how the focus narrows so much in Calvinist thought. People who study the architecture of Europe point out something very interesting in Calvinist homes that was not true in other homes, and that was the private room, a bedroom, a separate room in your house. That this way of looking at the world so shaped our identity that it even shaped the way that we got together. We would build private rooms because I didn't need to be with you anymore, because what you had was nothing that I could value. In fact, when Alexis de Tocqueville came here in 1825, and I told you that before, he was looking for a word to describe this way that Americans look at the world. And he coined the word individualism, the first time that word had ever been used to describe Americans. We are individualistic in many ways in our thinking. In fact, when Emerson came along, who was kind of the inheritor of these beliefs in a much more progressive way, he wrote his entire book called Self-Reliance, right? That was his book. Excuse me, that the only thing that we need to rely on is ourselves and our own way of being in the world, and that we need to be our own kind of repository of what is good and what is truthful. Americans ate that kind of stuff up for lots of reasons. If you think of the Horatio Alger novels of the day, Horatio Alger wrote the rags to riches novels, we call them. And in those stories, each time it's people who pull themselves up by their own bootstraps without supposedly relying on other people. This even influenced the way that we dealt charity in the United States. The American Bible Tract Society, which is right over there at Columbus Circle, they have a huge building, still exists to this day, was actually created during the time of charity in New York. People thought it was bad to give another person money because you weren't allowing them to struggle on their own for their own goodness, and you were making them soft and weak and demoralizing them by giving them charity. And so rather than handing you money, the American Bible Tract said, hand them a Bible tract that tells them to be self-reliant and to carry their own weight and do their own things in the world. Right? That has continued all the way up into modern times. We used to have a bill in this country called the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Aid to Families with Dependent Children. We did away with it and rewrote it. What's it now called? Anybody know? American Personal Responsibility Reconciliation Act. The American Personal Responsibility Reconciliation Act. Because people thought that giving charity to families who needed children and education and health care was not so important, that because it was destroying somehow the fabric of the nation, which only made it worse during the Cold War, when we distrusted any form of collectivism. And to this day, the word socialism in the United States is equivalent with evil. Equivalent with evil, because we're so fearful of anything to smack of working together in collectivism. We made the joke about that masked ranger, the Lone Ranger. Think of that, the perfect American hero who sits on the edge of town, rides in to fix whatever wrong you've done in the community, but at the end must ride off into the sunset alone by themselves. And it also includes into the way that we look at American cars. Take that way, the roads, the personal vehicle, having control, the way we do mass transit in this country. And look at the way it does with guns. That the most important thing is my right to a weapon is more important than the safety of our community and of our children. Because that happened once again. And I'm trying to stop from not having a little nervous breakdown about that. But we have put guns ahead of community safety because of this idea of a Second Amendment right, the right to bear arms individually. So these things, in a way, are also distortions, right? They're distortions of what ethics should be all about. Because in reality, our survival depends on community. Our survival depends on interdependence, on getting together. The first person who wrote about this so eloquently in the United States, excuse me, was Felix Adler. And Felix Adler, in the book he wrote called The Reconstruction of the Spiritual Ideal, said that what we need in this country right now, the most important thing we need is an ethics of groups. That's what we need. We don't have an ethics of groups. We have an ethics of personal or individualism and those kinds of stuff. And he wanted to create something where interdependence and reciprocity were the important kinds of ways of being. And he thought that because he thought that when we work together, when we struggle as a community, we work through our differences, we fight over disagreements, that something finer can emerge if we participate in that process. This is one of the few ethical societies, by the way, where the words, "we're all meet to seek the highest is holy ground," is not emblazoned on the back of the building. Right? In most of the ethical societies, it says we're all meet to seek the highest is holy ground, which is a kind of a statement that came out of the early ethical culturists about the specialness of trying to come back together and wrestle with these things and building all this up. However, we do realize that there's a problem of building an ethics on human relationships, and it's other people. That's the problem, right? Szymborska, in that same poem, she says, "One day perhaps some idle tongue mentions your name by accident. I feel as if a rose were flung into the room, all hue and scent. The next day you're here with me, and I can't help looking at the clock." It's also funny if you think of, I love Groucho Marx's comment that I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. Right? That's a great line because it also talks about the struggle we have to be with other people. And personally, because maybe we don't spend enough time on relationships and groups and working things together. Why and how did civics education become actually evil in this country as well? And we try to remove that in the school, this notion that we need other people. And of course, that leads to one of the saddest statements in human history, that mistakes were made. Yeah, mistakes happened a lot. The difficulty we also have with humans is it's hard for me to read your minds. I'm looking at you and I think, God, what the heck is he saying? How long is this going to end? What am I going to have for lunch? I don't know exactly what's going through your minds. I can imagine some of this stuff. But the difficulty we have of really knowing another person well and knowing what they're really thinking. For those of you, anybody here a Trekkie fan other than me? Okay, a couple people, there you go. There was an episode in Star Trek where they encounter these beings who are just forms of light, and they only interact with each other through light and through those kinds of stuff. And they're trying to fix the Enterprise. And so one of them says, "I know a lot about mechanics and this kind of stuff. Let me come into a body and I can figure that out." So they ask Spock to do it because they think he can control it. And the being enters into Spock's mind, and first thing he says is how wonderful this is. This is so great. Having a body is really so cool. And then his face changes and he goes, "How lonely you are. How lonely. I'm no longer connected to everybody else and knowing what's going on and things like that. I am ultimately alone inside of this thing." And he thought it was actually pretty horrible. We are actually not good at reading each other's minds. Now, I want to test that because I think it's good to be a scientist. So Jim, I'm going to read your mind. Let me see if I can do it right now. I'm going to guess the next word that's going to come out of his mouth. Hold on. I want you to think of a word. All right, think of a word. Hold on, don't say it. I'm going to see if I can figure it out. I'm going to guess the next word that's going to come out of your mouth is the word ethical.
Actually, my word is going to be thank you for that very provocative.
So is my word ethical? Yes or no?
Is your word ethical or is my word?
Yes, your word ethical.
No.
I guessed it right. Of course, being an ethical culturist, he had to give me the whole backstory before the answer, but there we go.
I didn't know we were limited to yes or no answers.
There we go. Yes, all of ethics is reduced to yes or no. Just remember that. I do that trick with my youth. I got a ton of tricks I do with the teenagers I work with, of course, and one of them is to tell them I can read their minds because I always want to know what they're thinking. The fact is we are not good at reading minds, right? We are not very good at that. We are surprisingly good at reading emotions. In fact, we have 72% of accuracy. If we were to take all the people in this room and we would put up a variety of different pictures or situations, you could probably correctly guess the emotion by 72%. That's pretty high. Who do you think does better at that, women or men? Wow. Supposedly women are better at it, a little bit better at it, and it may have to do less with the fact that men have any lack of ability. But as what many women researchers point out is that we often put ourselves in a situation where men don't have to pay attention as much to the children as women do, or other people in a certain way. And so actually the only thing that we need to reinforce is not the fact that they read minds better than they are, but put men in roles where they have to do often what women have to do, and the roles that we resign them into in society. So to what extent then would our ability just to respond to people's emotions and that feelings that drive those deep things and beliefs? There are lots of philosophers, a lot of psychologists who say that we have our set of beliefs inside of us, right? Erich Fromm says, I can intellectually assent to any opinion. You can argue long enough and eventually you're going to nod your head. But my real beliefs are embedded in my emotional matrix, which is a very different kind of thing. And we cannot read minds, but we can read emotions pretty accurately. And maybe that's partially how our responses should be. Now, Adler was a Victorian in many respects, but I think he kind of understood that. In his book, he also talks about what he called the 3 spiritual pains that all of us, our humanity collectively, he thought struggled with. The first is what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What's going on? What's happening? But his second thing he said, spiritual pain, was, and do I matter in that? Do I matter in this world, or am I just fodder for the great cosmic will? And if I matter, then why is there so much suffering in the world, right? If we matter, what is that? And he thought that what happens is all of us take ideology or belief systems and we wrap those around those central beliefs, right? We find answers to that. Why do I matter? Why are we here? What should we do? How should we live? This is what his taking of it, these spiritual pains. And therefore, if I argue over the color of your coat or the way that your beliefs are and try and pull those off of you, I forget how deeply attached those are to the things that really matter, which is down in your emotional matrix, was what his argued with. And so he formulated his theory of groups based on the first principle he thought we should do, which is that when you met someone, you would affirm the worth and dignity of that person. Because ultimately, one of the things people want to do is to matter in the world. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be loved, they want to be respected. And they may have a lot of crazy ideas wrapped around inside that coat, but deep down, he thought that there was something more. And that the way to address that difference was not to start off by just pulling open the ideas and saying, you're wrong, that belief doesn't matter, that's stupid, but starting by how can I affirm the worth and dignity of you? That doesn't mean I agree with you. It just means that when you're in my presence or we're in this space together that we collectively create, that you can feel that I care about you. And that we create places where our society feels and cares about us, because that's not the society we created outside. We have a society in the United States that almost says, make it on your own or fail. That's all that matters, and we're going to have a very basic safety net. Good luck, you're on your own. So he wanted to change all that. He wanted to create a society and a way of belief and an ethics that started with a basic question that says and addresses, do you matter? So I'm going to throw this to you. This is a pretty smart group. Now, I'm not just, trying to sell you something here. I think this is a pretty smart, heady group, both in person and online. And I know that when I speak with you, a lot of you tell me some really great ideas and about those kinds of stuff. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust researcher, he says, remember that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And that feeling that people don't care is really the indifference of the whole thing was the worst part of the Holocaust. Not the fact that the Nazis had spewed their hatred on racially different groups and or ethnically or religiously different groups, but that other people didn't care enough until later in the war to get in to stop them. So the ethical society is supposed to be a place where we affirm the worth and dignity of all people walking through the door. And I want to ask this group then, because you are such smart people, how can we do that better? How can we, as a society ensure that when you walk in that door, that our belief in the worth and dignity of people is palpable? How do you do that in your everyday relationships? How do you do that in your politics? How do you do that in the way you shop? I think you have some ideas about that. How do you affirm the worth and dignity of being? And so we're going to ask Jim to go around, and I want to just hear some of these responses, if you don't mind. So Jim, I'm going to have you, sorry to throw you on the spot there, not affirming your worth and dignity. I should give you a bigger head up. All right, now we're going to have you go around, and actually those 1, 2 can come forward if you want to be seen on the screen. And then we're going to take some from the Zoomosphere also.
Well, Curt, thank you very much for that invitation to all of us. I guess I'm going to kick it off by saying that one of the ways to affirm the worth and dignity of all people, even people who are masked or unmasked, is in our culture. You mentioned a lot of the religious antecedents of the way we live today in our society, and one of the big things that I think we often overlook is the elephant in the room, and that is that our society was founded on an intertwining of religion and slavery, and religion as a justification for slavery. And it lasted for hundreds of years before we became a country, and continued to last even after we became a country. And you mentioned that we seem to have a Calvinist objection to giving people help. Well, our society was founded on help, free help, through force. And I'm wondering how that affects our society even today, and what we can do to overcome the effects. And that would be a good way of seeing the worth and dignity of all people. First, recognize that all people really are people. Anyone else? Lisa.
My response is much simpler, much shorter, and I'm going to just start with just basic human relations in this room or anywhere. When we interact with people, I think a good lesson is to listen. I think not enough people listen and really hear what others are saying. Sometimes we get caught up in our own thoughts and want to express that and do a lot of talking, and we don't take time to listen. So my input would be just listen more.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else? Susan.
So I work with children who have multiple disabilities. Many of them are in wheelchairs and have difficulty getting into buildings. And so here we have steps on one side and we have a ramp as well. And so there's a thing in our education system called universal design, or if you build it, they will come. So to get rid of the steps and get the ramp in so people of all abilities, anybody can use it. You don't need a wheelchair, you can be in it. So to be thinking, if we build it, they will come, to allow people, anyone, to come in.
Thank you, Susan. Ron. Oh, let's take a couple. Okay, let's take 2 from the Zoomosphere. Do we have anyone on Zoom?
Yes, we do. Sorry, it took me a second there to get unmuted. Mark, go ahead. Mark.
Oh, yeah. So I just want to follow up on the concept of listening. So not only is it important to respect the dignity and to care, it's not just a question of listening, but in the response, to consider the response should really take into account what was said and not just express your view over and against what you were listening to, but to try to make the response sensitive and engaged with what we heard and how it affects us emotionally, intellectually, and to express, how we feel about what was said or any suggestions. So the response is really directed towards the needs of the other person.
Thank you, Mark. Is there anyone else from the Zoomosphere there?
Yes, we have a hand raised from Neil. There you go.
So I want to say this. So I work in a field with families and children children who are on the spectrum. So the facilitation of communication and listening is paramount. And in general, what listening is in typical or non-neurotypical situations, in just general, our individuality has become so compartmentalized, not just because we have to look behind the Calvinist tradition, and what that has evolved into is that the reason we sectionalize ourselves off and close off is not just because we do not listen, is that because our autonomic nervous system is always in a state of hyperarousal, of defensiveness. So when we're in a state of defense, we begin facially, bodily to pull away. So we have to begin to understand and respect those defenses and somehow cultivate the conditions of relational safety. It's breathing, looking, feeling in a much more relaxful way. You know, we go to different parts of the country, we see different interactions. I've seen it on the West Coast, in parts of the West Coast. People are more relaxed, they're breathing, they're looking, they're interacting. So we have to learn that we have been conditioned to be in a state in a hyperarousal, and we have to learn the importance to cultivate the conditions of safety, feelings of interrelational safety in order to co-regulate with one another. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go back to the room for two. Ron.
Yeah, really quick, and the reason why I'm married to Lisa is that we agree on so many things. Listening was exactly what I was going to say, but not just listening, but listening with respect to that other person's beliefs, and then to seek commonality between the two of you.
Thank you, Ron.
Hi. Okay. I love listening. I think that's so important. I think it's important to listen, to empathize, to affirm what the other person is saying, doing, or feeling, and to validate, really validate it, and then to, if there's a solution required, to gear towards the solution, whatever that might be. I worked with children for many, many, many years. I specialized with children and children's hair care, and what I learned in studying and working, especially with neurologically diverse children, you must listen. You must hear their needs. And so many parents would get embarrassed because they would throw tantrums, or they didn't like how it looked, what was happening, and to really, really weed past that and listen to what the child needs, and to establish rapport. It goes with adults too, but I think a good formula is really listening and empathizing and trying to get on that level to really hear what somebody's saying, to feel what somebody's saying and what they need in that moment, validating it, and then gearing towards a solution if one is required. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I'm going to say what other people have said, but I want to go a little bit deeper. My experience comes from running singles groups for 20 years. Yes, listening is, you must understand that listening is an active skill. It is not passive, because the things you got to learn is where you leave off and the other person begins. One of the things that's really important, I look at the various singles groups online and see what people say. And what they say has nothing to do with a relationship. It's usually a list of before I die activities, rather than something deeper about themselves. One of the problems that we have is we all ask for honesty. And will you be honest? But in order to be honest, you have to know what you're feeling. it isn't often, for example, if I have a fight with my ex or something like that, we have a terrible fight that in the morning over something stupid like eggs or whatever, and we don't like what our spouse prepared. But in the next day, we look at it and say, what was that really about? Part of the tools that require for listening is to first put yourself in the head of the person that you're talking to. And you do that by an intellectual process, and you can do it by an emotional one. The emotional process works if you understand what's going on inside of you and how you're affecting the particular relationship. So listening becomes an active skill with tools. And the tools begin with putting yourself in the head of the person you're talking to, but then understanding how you're reacting. And if you understand how you're reacting, you can separate the two of you. But ultimately, you'll come back to the emotional intelligence part of it, which means that you'll begin to understand why a person feels the way they feel. And that takes removal of yourself for a while, and then utilization of yourself.
I think one way, and I'm sure almost everybody in ethical does this, is when you're out and about in the world, just to say please and thank you whenever somebody does anything for you, whether it's the cashier at a grocery store or it's the person who's bagging your groceries, or getting on a train and giving a bus and giving somebody a ticket. To say please and to say thank you, I think does more to validate the people that you meet just for an instant than anything else. And too many times I don't see people doing that. So I try very hard, and I'll yell out if I haven't said please, I'll yell it out in the middle of a transaction just to make sure that somebody's heard me.
Thank you, Ruth.
Very good.
Thank you.
Jim, we do have one more. We haven't heard from yet on Zoom. Do we have time for one more?
We have time for one more, yes.
All right, Javier, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good morning to everybody. I just wanted to say that one of the things that I see that we miss between ourselves is that the most valuable thing that we have is ourselves. We don't do that connect. We listen to people, we talk, but do we really connect? That's something that we miss. I don't feel like people really connect with each other. And I feel like some people probably find that too intimate to connect with people they don't know. But I feel like every opportunity up there is something that we had, and we shouldn't miss it when it's there, to connect with everybody at every level that is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Well, I've heard so many wonderful responses, all having to do with connecting with each other. Now that we've become slaves to the screen during the COVID pandemic, I sure hope it doesn't take us 40 years in the desert to learn how to reconnect. I think we need to start now.
Thank you, Jim.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and I really appreciate that. I'm always inspired by the great words of Dr. Seuss that unless someone carries a lot, it's not going to get buried. Excuse me. Unless someone cares a lot, it's not going to be better. It's not. So just remember those things. So in my closing words, I searched the world through the most important speakers and historical figures and great religious thinkers to find these words. And this comes from a woman named Marilyn Monroe. Not sure who she is, but she says, "I'm selfish, impatient, and a little insecure. I make mistakes, I'm out of control, and at times hard to handle. But if you can't handle me at my worst, then you sure as hell don't deserve me at my best." Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ ethicalfocus.org and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.